So again, welcome everybody. My name is Willow Kelly, and I am the first of hopefully many virtual death doulas who've joined the network co-founded by the three people who are also presenting the Salon today, and it is a privilege to work with them. And they are Andrea, Emily, and Daniel. And you'll be hearing from all three of them today with some of their holiday wisdom around grief and navigating loss around this time of year. So we're grateful that you're here. Again, we're recording this for YouTube, so cameras and names as you will. I wanted to begin today with doing a little bit of a meditation. Grief being part of what we are talking about for this salon, and wanting to bring a place of harmony and sweetness with that grief into this present moment. So this is going to be very brief, about 5 or 6 minutes. So I invite you to get comfortable for a short meditation. And that might mean sitting, lying down, standing and swaying back and forth, whatever feels nice in your body. I invite you to follow that wisdom. And just begin to take a couple of deep breaths to center yourself in this present moment, to oxygenate your blood that is traveling all through your body and nourishing you. Just breathing and being present in this moment. I invite you to think about a rose in its perfection, when it's opened just right and so fragrant, so beautiful, and yet it's covered with thorns on its stem. And roses have long been a symbol of love, because we know to pick a rose is to risk pain by virtue of the thorns of the rose. And yet we cannot resist their beauty. We cannot resist their fragrance. So we reach into the thorns for the rose. So we dare, just as we dare to love, because we know that when we love, that grief is its inseparable twin. That when we choose love, when we reach in, we're going to brush those thorns of grief, because that is a manifestation of love. In homeopathy and herbal remedies, roses are used to heal the heart with protection, because the rose symbolizes that love and that openness, but the thorns protect that openness. So thinking of rose as a heart healing, protected openness. And I want to talk about honey. Honey has been a symbol of eternal life, of healing, of the power of nature to preserve and to renew. And the honeybees have been so revered through time that religions have formed around them, that there are millions of devotees alive today to the honeybee. We've learned that they collect nectar and pollen. They make honey, this miraculous substance that people have been using as medicine and collecting for over 8,000 years. And 55-year-old honey was discovered, still perfect honey. And the honeybee, with the pollen, with the nectar, they nourish their young, they function in a democratic society, they pollinate our food, they pollinate much of the beauty around us. So our love is like a rose. It may bring pain with the choosing of it, but it is worth it. our legacy for those who come after us, whether they're of our bodies or of our spirits or our minds, those who come after us are the honey and the pollen, the food that nourishes the young and ensures the future of the young by pollinating what they need. And our living, our lives are like the honeybees, where our job is to gather the treasures of those we have loved to have gone before, to make honey with the sweetness of their lives, with their nectar, the light of the legacy that we carry in our hearts. And gathering, pollinating for future generations the love and wisdom that was bestowed on us by our beloved dead. So our grief and our love are inseparable twins. And to reach in to pluck the rose, we navigate the thorns of grief, and it is worth it. I invite you to imagine rose water with a drop of honey, drinking it into your body, feeling that healing, that openness, that protection, that renewal, infusing you on every level. Take another breath or two of gratitude and love for those who have gone before. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and stretch your body, maybe give yourself a shake or a little shoulder massage. Bring yourself back to this moment together here in this holiday death salon with the virtual Death Doula Network. And now I'd like to turn it over to Andrea.
Hi, I am Andrea Sugar, co-founder and one of the doulas at the virtual Death Doula Network. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that is personal to me, as well as something that comes up a lot in what we do. And it's so that you didn't get to say goodbye. Now what? It's normal to feel guilty if you weren't able to say goodbye to a loved one before they died, to feel angry, regretful, maybe even ashamed. These feelings may feel overwhelming and awful. However, finding ways to be kind and gentle with yourself can help ease these challenging feelings. Life and death are unpredictable. There is no fail-safe way to know what will happen and when. In fact, it's a common occurrence for the dying to wait for their loved ones to leave before they're ready to let go and transition out of this life. Finding ways to be tender and forgiving to yourself are essential and necessary. It is important to understand that not being there or not getting to say goodbye does not make you a bad person, nor does it make you uncaring or thoughtless. This is part of being human. This is true regardless of whether you were present at the time of death or if the death was unexpected. In order to move with these challenging emotions, there are several practices that can be really helpful. Writing a letter to your loved one saying everything you want to say can be incredibly healing. You can then keep the letter, can bury it, burn it, or do anything else with the message that you feel appropriate. I would encourage you to read the letter out loud and talk to your loved one. This is an incredible opportunity to tell them goodbye and to find some healing. Finding simple but meaningful ways to honor your loved one can also be helpful. You might make their favorite meal, play their favorite music, create a compilation of photos either in an album or online, and then share these things with others close to you. Be patient with yourself and know that these emotions may come and go. They may come up strongly or you may feel numb, and both are normal. When emotions do well up or feel stomped down, this is often a wonderful time to share memories with other friends or loved ones, or even online. We have a Facebook grief support group, and we will put the link to that in the chat. And there are many other groups out there as well that are excellent and safe spaces to share these moments and memories. Journaling can be another great outlet for release. Write exactly what you feel as it comes up without worrying about how it looks or sounds. For me, I didn't make it back to see my grandmother when she died. I was 18 and it was Thanksgiving. I chose not to get on the plane to fly home because I didn't grasp how real it was, and I thought I would see her over the Hanukkah Christmas holiday the next month. Truth be told, I was a selfish 18-year-old that didn't want to get on a plane and leave the West Coast where I was living. My grandmother died the day after Thanksgiving. She was my best friend. I felt like I failed her, my parents, myself. I didn't get to say goodbye or I love you. I didn't get to say anything. I let my best friend down, my grandma. That is all I could think of. I can't change the choice that I made. And even though it was selfish of me to not get on that plane for so many reasons, there was no way that I could have known. So I forgive myself for that. I've had many conversations with my grandma, many out loud apologies, and many giggles since then. Despite my sadness and some lingering regret, because I am human after all, I have found peace with myself and with my grandma. I miss her all of the time. But now when I think about how I wasn't able to say goodbye, there's no longer the charge that used to accompany it, but rather an acceptance of what happened and a tenderness in my heart. I still talk to her all the time, and it still helps. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. That was beautiful. Emily, would you like to talk to us next about survivor's guilt?
Sure. My topic tonight is survivor's guilt. Can everyone hear me all right? By the way, I have like a little space heater going on. Okay. All right. So survivor's guilt. There's a lot to say about the topic, so I'm just gonna hit some main points. Survivor's guilt is also known as survivor syndrome or survivor disorder. I'm going to use the term survivor's guilt just for simplicity. So the definition of survivor's guilt, depending on where you look, is a mental condition that develops in people who have survived a life-threatening, traumatic, or tragic situation when others have not. Have survived one of those situations when others have not. It's actually recognized as a symptom as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a quote-unquote normal response in grief. So it's pretty common and usually resolved somewhat. For some, the guilt stems from feeling as if they could have done more or done things differently in that certain situation, perhaps saving people's lives or changing the outcome. Some people may feel a sense of injustice, asking themselves, why did I survive and the others didn't? Why me? Why them? Life isn't fair, that kind of thing. There's three kind of categories of survivor's guilt. The first being general survivor's guilt, the second being parental, and the third being survivor guilt with specific incident. So the first, general survivor guilt, refers to feelings of guilt associated with living and going on after someone else dies or is killed. It's difficult to reconcile feeling grateful to be alive while knowing that others did not share the same fate. Further complicating general survivor guilt is the fact that some survivors struggle with unresolved conflicts with the deceased. So survivors may feel a certain loss of hope in knowing that they were unable to make amends before a loved one's death. This can leave someone feeling hanging, like in limbo, really uncomfortable, that kind of thing. Parental survivor guilt occurs when a child dies and yet the parent survives. This type of guilt is particularly distressing because of the unique challenges brought about when a child dies before his or her parents. It really doesn't matter how old the child was. The unique connection between a parent and a child leaves a parent especially vulnerable, and however unnatural, unjust, or illogical it may seem, a child may die before a parent. That's kind of what they feel. The majority of people feel. They feel like it's unnatural, unjust, illogical. It doesn't make sense to them why their child should die and they should survive. Survivor guilt with specific incident takes place when an individual survives a traumatic event while others involved in the same traumatic events did not survive, such as with an impaired driving crash or a natural catastrophe. This is kind of what comes to mind first when you think of survivor's guilt. People think of an accident or an incident that happened, a trauma. Some examples of events that could result in survivor's guilt are surviving a cancer diagnosis, living through the AIDS epidemic, receiving a transplant, having a loved one commit suicide, surviving war, surviving the Holocaust. And people with this kind of guilt can experience other symptoms of PTSD, including flashbacks, obsessive thoughts, irritability, anger, feelings of helplessness, disconnection, fear, confusion, lack of motivation, difficulty sleeping, headaches, nausea, social isolation, thoughts of suicide. And as with PTSD, survivor's guilt may cause a person to see the world as an unfair and unsafe place, as I said before. I'm going to just quickly share my screen and show you a graphic that I found. Start share. So here's the graphic. There's a burning building. So this is an incident, obviously, that's happened. This person in the blanket has survived, and feelings of helplessness, stomach aches, irritability, anxiety happen. Trouble sleeping and thinking about people who have died. So now that we have a more solid understanding about what this kind of guilt is, we can ask ourselves how we can help others and ourselves cope if we do experience this type of guilt, or someone that we love or know experiences it. So for ourselves, it's best to try to acknowledge and try to accept the feelings and understand they're perfectly quote unquote normal, and celebrate that our own lives do not in any way diminish our sorrow and grief over those who were lost. Talking about how we feel with other victims and survivors and support groups can be really healing. Knowing that we're not alone in feeling these things can help on the healing journey. And recognizing that the fact that while we survived and others did not, that is sort of an unanswerable question. No one can answer why. No one can answer why we survived and someone else didn't. So try not to dwell on those questions, those unanswerable, mysterious questions. And finding ways to keep the memory of those who were killed alive. This can be done on a small scale, like creating a memory book or donating to a group that you feel is connected to the loss, participating in larger memorial events, things like that. And trying to not let our guilt keep us from responding to our own needs and our own wants and desires and things of that nature. Being present, like Andrea said, journaling, being present, meditating, all those self-care techniques. And of course, accessing assistance if you need assistance, grief counseling, PTSD counseling, that kind of thing from professionals. Very important to note. And for helping a loved one, in my opinion, just being there is the most powerful healing salve we can offer. Acknowledge that they're in pain, acknowledge that they're suffering. You don't have to fix this thing that they're going through. That's not always the job at hand. You might just sit with them, commiserate with them. It's best not to say things like, just get over it, you're being silly, of course you can't do anything to change it, that kind of thing. It just tends to close someone off. So just being there, allowing them to say what they want to say, maybe bring them a meal, help with their errands, that kind of thing. and help them understand also that this is common and, again, quote unquote normal, something a lot of people experience, and maybe help them access those tools we were talking about before, meditation, support groups, that kind of thing. And that's all I really have at the moment. I do have a very helpful document that I'm going to share with everybody when we send out our resources, and maybe also that graphic. And I also want to remind everyone that we have the grief support group on Facebook as well, and we're always there to lend a hand in terms of resources and an ear. And we also just have you can hire us to help counsel. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you for sharing your wisdom of how to be with grief. It reminded me of one of my favorite poems called When You Meet Someone Deep in Grief by Patricia McKernan Runkle, and I will read it to you here. When you meet someone deep in grief, slip off your needs and set them by the door. Enter barefoot this darkened chapel, hollowed by loss, hollowed by sorrow, hallowed by sorrow. Its gray stone walls and floor. You, congregation of one, are here to listen, not to sing. Kneel in the back pew, make no sound, let the candles speak. And now I'd like to turn it over to co-founder Daniel to talk to us about complicated grief. Daniel?
All right, thank you, Wello. Yes, hi, excuse me, I'm Daniel Shaw, and I am a doula and co-founder of the Virtual Death Doula Network, and I'm here to share with you some information about complicated grief today. Losing a loved one is one of the most distressing and unfortunately common experiences that people face. Most people experiencing normal grief and bereavement have a period of sorrow, numbness, even guilt and anger, and gradually these feelings ease and it's possible to accept loss and move forward. But for some people, feelings of loss are debilitating and don't improve even after time passes. And this is what's known as complicated grief, sometimes called persistent complex bereavement disorder. And in complicated grief, painful emotions are so long lasting and severe that you have trouble recovering from the loss and resuming your own life. Grief is a person's response to loss, entailing emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, as well as physiological changes. And grief is permanent after we lose someone close through its manifestation. Those manifestations are variable both within and between people. Still, there are some commonalities that help you recognize complicated grief and sort of the phases that we move through, starting with acute grief, which occurs in the initial period after the loss. It almost always includes strong feelings of yearning, longing, and sadness, along with anxiety, bitterness, anger, remorse, guilt, and or shame. And thoughts are mostly focused on the person who died. It can be difficult to concentrate on anything else, and acute grief pretty much dominates the person's life. The next sort of step that we want to get into is integrated grief, which is the result of adaptation to this loss. So when a person adapts to the loss, the grief isn't over, but instead thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to those loss become integrated in ways that allow them to remember and honor the person that died, and the grief finds a place in their life. And so complicated grief occurs when something interferes with this adaptation. And so that's when this happens, the acute grief can persist for very long periods of time. And a person with complicated grief feels intense emotional pain. They can't stop feeling like their loved one might somehow reappear, and they don't see a pathway forward. A future without their loved one seems forever dismal and unappealing. And again, the intense waves or pockets of grief can pop up at any time, even years later, particularly around the holidays. And that's typical and common, and will in most cases pass, in which case it's not complicated grief. It's just part of your personal integrated grief at that point. Excuse me. So what are symptoms During the first few months after a loss, many signs and symptoms of normal grief are the same as those of complicated grief because you're in that acute phase still. However, while normal grief symptoms gradually start to fade over time, those with complicated grief linger or even get worse. And complicated grief is like being in an ongoing heightened state of mourning that keeps you from healing. So specifically, some symptoms can include intense sorrow, pain, and rumination over the loss of your loved one, focus on little else but your loved one's death, extreme focus on reminders of the loved one or excessive avoidance of reminders, intense and persistent longing or pining for the deceased, problems accepting the death, numbness, detachment, bitterness about your loss, feelings that life just holds no meaning or purpose, a lack of trust in others, or an inability to enjoy life or think back on positive experience you had with your loved one. It can also be indicated if you have trouble just carrying out normal routines, if you're isolating from others and withdrawing from social activities, experiencing signs of depression, deep sadness, guilt, self-blame, believing that you did something wrong or could have prevented the death, or feeling that life just isn't worth living without your loved one. Or maybe even wishing you had died along with your loved one. And so it's not known what causes complicated grief. With many mental health disorders, it may involve your environment, personality, genetics, your body's natural chemical makeup. But there are certain risk factors that can make people more prone to complicated grief. It does occur more often in women and people that are older. And factors that may increase the risk of developing complicated grief can include if it's an unexpected or violent death, such as a death from a car accident, the death of a child, close or dependent relationship to the deceased person, if you're very close to the person, social isolation or loss of a support system or friendships. Another risk factor is if you do have a history of PTSD or separation anxiety already. Of course, traumatic childhood experiences such as abuse or neglect can contribute to all these sort of things, and any other major life stressors like financial hardships. And of course, it can complicate other things as well. Complicated grief can affect you physically, mentally, socially, and without treatment, things can get worse and can lead to depression, suicidal thoughts, anxiety or PTSD, sleep disturbances, physical illnesses, heart disease, cancer even, long-term difficulty with just daily living, your relationships, work, just all falling down. And unfortunately, alcohol, nicotine, or just substance use in general in response to the grief. So prevention then. It's not clear exactly how to prevent complicated grief. Getting counseling soon after a loss can help, especially for people who are in that increased risk category. In addition, caregivers providing end-of-life care for a loved one can benefit from counseling and support to help prepare for the death and its emotional aftermath. So some of those things that we can do are talking and just talking about your grief, allowing yourself to cry can also help you prevent from getting just stuck in the sadness. As painful as it is, trust that in most cases, your pain will start to lift if you allow yourself to feel it. Seeking out support, family members, friends, social support groups, and your faith community are all great options to help you work through your grief. You may be able to find a support group focused on your particular type of loss, such as the death of a spouse or a child. Ask your health professionals to recommend local resources. And there's bereavement counseling too. Through early counseling immediately after the loss, you can explore the emotions surrounding your loss and learn healthy coping skills. And this can potentially prevent negative thoughts and beliefs from gaining such a strong hold that they become difficult to remove. And on that note, that's pretty much all I've got on this right now. So thank you so much. I'll include information, some slides and some resources as to where I got this information from as part of the follow-up email that we'll be sending out after this salon. And with that, I will turn it back over to Willow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. There are so many different tools. Daniel made a list of some of the ones that are fairly accessible. Andrea talked a little bit about the grief and anxiety support group. I wanted to bring your attention to the link to that in our chat for the Facebook page, especially. One of the beauties of that is that because it's on Facebook and different people are joining it, you already have a community of people who are experiencing grief, anxiety, loss. So it's forming that sort of network of community that was mentioned earlier as a way of healing and connecting. You can also schedule one-on-one appointments for grief and anxiety support with the doulas of this network. And it's actually the area that we're finding the most activity in the services that we offer right now. So we just want to let people know, you may not be experiencing it now, but if you want to copy that Facebook page for friends of yours, people that you know that might be experiencing grief and anxiety, just send this along to them so that they can find a virtual community and the kind of help and resources that will help them through their journey with grief. I wanted to talk too about a couple of physical things that you can do to help grief move along. If you're a yoga practitioner, you can look up yoga for grief and you'll find a series of poses for people who want to move that grief through their bodies. And some simple things that you can do that are sort of, some of these are practices from faith traditions. Some of this is some yogic practice, is doing things where when you breathe, you open the chest, letting the shoulders drop and fall back while allowing the heart to be lifted up. So imagining that that breastbone is coming up, that the heart is opening like a flower and the shoulders are dropping back. And when we're able to do that in our bodies are dictating to our brains how to feel. It's a feedback loop. So when we do that openness, when we drop those shoulders and lift our hearts up and just breathe into that, we are assuring our central nervous system, that vagus nerve, that it's safe to be open-hearted and that we can be strong in that openness, including thinking about the honeybees and the roses and the honey. Maybe doing a meditation about that. If you're feeling a lot of grief, maybe you can imagine yourself as a honeybee going to this one whom you are grieving and collecting the nectar and the pollen of their lives and the gifts that they gave to you, and thinking about how you metabolize those and carry them into the future and pass them along and give them away. So sometimes just that brief meditation might help with some grief. As we mentioned before, processing with others with the same or similar loss is really helpful. People alluded to this in things that they said, but the loss of a child is different than the loss of a mate, which is different from the loss of a mother, which is different from the loss of a father. But in those losses, there are familiar spaces to meet with other people. So there are lots of wonderful grief resources that we shared last month in our newsletter. And I wanted to let you know, if you're not currently on our newsletter, there's going to be a link here shortly in our chat where you can sign up. And this is also a link that we encourage you to share through your social media and your different networks so that people have these points of connection. I wanted to talk a little bit about one of my favorite writers who I met at a National Home Funeral Alliance conference. Her name is Lucinda Herring, and she wrote a book called Reimagining Death: Stories and Practical Wisdom for Home Funerals and Green Burials. And one of the things that she talks about over and over again in her book are ways in which it feels like, if we're paying attention, that nature collaborates with our grief and our loss. There are ways that nature shows up for us that can be a rather mystical experience when we're in that place of grief. And I chose a story from her book to read to you because it talks about the collaboration, but it also talks about the bees. So again, I invite you to get comfortable and listen to a story about death and bees. This is a true story, a true recounting of when her father died, of Lucinda's father. I think the bees knew that Papa was dying. In some strange empathic communion, one of our hives had developed a bee infestation, and there were black masses of insects infiltrating the supers at the same time Papa's cancer was spreading throughout his body. Our bees had been healthy for years, no disease or colony collapse, no problems to speak of, and now this. Papa was the beekeeper, the one whom the ladies knew and trusted with their honey and with their lives. It was as if this one hive had decided to accompany their friend in his suffering, even go with him across the veil. We went down together to deal with the crisis, Papa in a cotton shirt that clung to his thin, emaciated body like a shroud, his slow, uncertain gait across the field, so different from his usual pace, so sad. My brother Hal marched ahead in purposeful strides, revealing a chronic impatience and masking the deeper unraveling going on inside him. Losing our father was a fierce and demanding task, one he could meet, but the toll was considerable. The October afternoon sun was bright and warm, a mocking contrast to our mission of death, for we intended to burn the infested hive so that the beetles could not migrate over to the other supers nearby. I wondered what Papa must be feeling as he pulled on his bee suit and headgear. The bees were his friends, his constant companions since Mama's death years before. Perhaps destroying the beetles would be cathartic, giving him a sense of power to counteract his own futile longing to remain alive a little longer. I just want to live until the persimmons ripen, Luli, and the leaves finish falling, Papa had said that morning, his eyes moist and his face so wistful. Life is truly dear, isn't it? I'm sure gonna miss being here, miss being alive. Here was our Alabama land in a mountain cove at the end of a lane, up a steep stony drive where old log cabins nestled in the woods as if they had always grown there. Though Papa really never retired from practicing law, he had changed his high-powered life, being a trial lawyer in town, to spend his days cutting wood, growing a garden, and canning food, driving the tractor across the bottomlands, making scuppernong wine, and giving honey away to all his church friends and family. His was a good life, with a new woman companion from church and days spent on the mountain or driving into town to teach Bible classes about the divine feminine to all the old ladies in the little Episcopal church he helped start. This after the diocese ordained women, an act he heartily disapproved of. And yet, after Mama died, the feminine stalked Papa like a lover, and in his later years, he kept his hands in the dirt and his heart open to her whispers and her wisdom. My Southern, rather patriarchal father told me once that in the early weeks of anguish after losing Mama, the only thing that really helped his pain was to go down to the garden and bury his face in the earth. His capacity to stretch and grow rather than stay frozen in older ways of being moves me to this day. Grief was Papa's agent of transformation. It cracked him open, and now it was helping him die. We all felt that his lung cancer, an illness often associated with loss and grieving, probably began in those searing weeks after Mama died. Papa and Hal carefully dismantled the damaged hive, placing the supers which were full of lethargic, struggling bees in a row on the ground. I came closer and saw the black beetles swarming over the ground, swarming over the wax comb, wreaking havoc with the ordered and tidy kingdoms within. Hal told us to move back, stepping forward with a blowtorch. Without hesitating, he aimed the intense flame into the inner recesses of the boxes so that bees, beetles, and comb were suddenly engulfed in acrid smoke and fire. Papa stood under the tall cedar tree whose low branches served as a shelter for the hives, a shelter for him too in this moment. I noticed for the first time that the netting on Papa's headgear was black, not white like Hal's. From where I stood, I could no longer see my father's face. He was hidden behind a dark veil, hesitant, hovering at the borderlands. Behind him, the sky was achingly blue and the air was filled with the humming of other bees in the branches. As I gazed, the sun's rays caught Papa's whole image, outlining his frail form with a bright halo of light. It won't be long, I thought, witnessing this moment, this image of portending death. I sensed Papa's life force already loosening its hold and spiraling upward and out, like the dark coils of smoke swirling and billowing forth from the boxes where his bees lay burning. Later, I went over to the workshop across the gully from the house to check on the status of Papa's cherry wood casket. Margaret's partner, Ray, talked to a local craftsman and got directions for building a simple box from wood Papa already had on the mountain, beautiful milled planks he had saved and cherished for years. Hal and a young man, Brian, who had been Papa's friend and co-worker, helped Ray build Papa's little ship of death, as D.H. Lawrence called it. Though our father loved woodwork and could have come at any time to view his casket, he never did, though he knew the men were hard at work evenings and weekends. I found this odd, though I tried to understand. I guess Papa loved living so much he didn't want to contemplate being dead, which his own fine casket would insist he do. Just like he didn't want to talk about me putting him on dry ice during his after-death vigil in the dining room, though he was able to laugh and joke about being a flayed herring on ice, that being his name, Fish Herring. His real name was Harold, but people rarely called him anything but Fish. When I opened the workshop door, Papa's bees were swarming everywhere. Someone had left the windows open to the honey room. The ladies had left their hives down in the meadows and made their way up to the hill to confiscate their stolen treasure. That was to be expected. What I didn't expect was to see hundreds of bees circling Papa's casket in a spiraling dance that to me was unmistakably focused and intentional. Old lore says that one must run and tell the bees when their keeper dies and cover the hives with a black veil for 3 nights and 3 days. Just as the diseased bees seemed to know about and take on Papa's illness, these sisters were communing with and blessing the box that would take their keeper down off the mountain and away from them forever. Theirs was a dance of realization, acceptance, and honoring. Their warm, steady humming, a portent of all that was, all that had to be. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Andrea, and then we'll close with a poem and have some Q&A time. Andrea?
Thank you, Willow. That was absolutely beautiful. So this part always is a little bit tricky for me, but wanted to explain to everyone that we really work to serve everyone regardless of where they are in life. And right now, roughly 20% of the Virtual Death Doula Network's clients are paying the full suggested price for services, while the rest are supported by kind donations we've received and the volunteered time of our doulas. So we're really imploring anyone to donate any amount that you're able to. Contributing helps, and it's incredibly appreciated. And this is what allows us to serve everyone that needs support. You can find the link to donate in the chat as well as on our website. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so all donations are tax deductible. And again, we really appreciate it because it is these donations that allow us to continue to serve worldwide and to everyone and anyone that needs it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You'll see in the chat box that there is a link for donations to our PayPal account. So again, this can be something that you use yourself or you pass on to friends who you think would be happy to support our venture. And also, you're going to see here shortly a link to our mailing list. And that is on our homepage of our website. You just scroll down to the bottom and it gives you the option to sign up for our newsletter. And that will have future salons as well as the resources from this salon. So we'll share the book title and the different links that we've talked about and things of that nature. Let's see. Yeah. I think that's the thing. And I understand that someone asked about the name of the book again, so I will tell you. And she's such a lovely woman, and the whole book is a delight to read. We just read it slowly and treasured it like a good meal. Lucinda Herring, that's Herring. And the book is Reimagining Death, Stories and Practical Wisdom for Home Funerals and Green Burials. But if you just Google her name and Reimagining Death, you'll find the link to the book, and you'll also find a link to her website. So before we transition into our Q&A, I wanted to share a poem that I was touched by with this idea of pollen and legacy and feeding the young with the lives that have gone before. This is called I Will Not Die, An Unlived Life by Donna Markova. I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I choose to risk my significance, to live so that that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. Thank you everyone for coming today. We really appreciate you, and we're open for Q&A that you can either direct to us generally or to specific people, whatever you desire. Any questions or comments or insights?
Or if anyone has any shares that they would like to speak about, particularly if it relates to anything we talked about today. Maybe you didn't get there to say goodbye. Maybe you've experienced complicated grief or survivor's grief, or maybe you're just having a hard time surrounding the holidays. This is a really safe space to talk about those things, and we welcome you to do so.
Should we just talk or? Okay. Like a couple of weeks ago, we were on vacation, and our first day of vacation, my stepfather passed away while we were at the beach. And my mom is just devastated. She won't talk about it because she's just really withdrawn. And I'm like, how do I talk to you? I don't like, I'm just having a lot of difficulty trying to figure out what to say to her. I don't want to like push her if she's not ready either. So, but she never talks about anything. So I wouldn't know when she's ready anyway.
Well, what if instead of talking about how she felt, you talk to her about how you felt and maybe open the conversation that way?
Yeah.
Because sometimes there can be a lot of power and tenderness in sharing our own grief or our own concerns or hard feelings. And that can give somebody a window to feel like a little more okay to step into theirs and to feel safe to maybe gingerly put a toe in the pool of that grief. So if that's something you're comfortable with, sharing how you feel, just saying, hey, you know, this has really been on my mind and in my heart.
Okay. I can do that.
Yes, some of the best advice for being with grief for me has been to just actually say what you just said. I have no idea what to say to you. This is such a tremendous loss. And then just express that you're there and that you can follow their lead. Like if you want to talk about it, I'll talk with you about it. If you want to make inappropriate jokes, I'll go there with you too. If you want to just not talk about it at all, I can hold that as well. But for me, it's just assuring people that however the grief is showing up for them, it's okay. And I can be with you with it.
Yeah. Christmas is going to be so scary. So not scary, but sad. So thank you guys for doing this stuff.
Feelings
Thank you for being brave and sharing. Oh, sorry, Emily.
No, I just wanted to honor that feeling, that feelings can be scary, and that's not silly at all, or a less feeling than any other feeling. And I also want to say thanks for your sensitivity with your loved one, and in recognizing that she is not ready and not pressuring her. I think that's really sensitive and should be recognized.
And Anna also shared in the chat that she wasn't there to say goodbye to her father and had been estranged from the rest of the family, hadn't seen him in years, and there were a lot of complicated feelings. And it's really common and it's really hard. And I give you a lot of props for being brave and sharing this, because sometimes even just putting it in writing or putting it in words can be so tender. But this is where we start from. This is where we start to kind of take some of the taboo away and get into I mean, again, we don't love using the word normal, but these things are normal. These are a part of life and part of the life cycle. So we really are grateful that you chose to share, and please feel free if you have anything else you'd like to share, as this is an experience that a lot of people share, including myself.
This also touches on something that Andrea talked about last month in our salon, which is when a relationship like that ends because someone has died, we also have the grief of losing the opportunity of reconciliation in the future. So there's the grief of losing them in the first place, and then it's complicated by this additional grief that perhaps what you had hoped for in terms of a healing in that relationship, or an understanding, or a clear cutting, or whatever felt right and necessary didn't get to happen.
And that's maybe where talking to the person out loud, writing notes to them, journaling might be of assistance.
There are a lot of really wonderful artistic outlets for grief on the internet right now, including writing and creating installation art and doing all different kinds of projects. I think we sent out some of those in some of our previous salons, but we can certainly send out a few more as well. I see that Amanda wrote in the chat, do you have recommendations for processing multiple deaths at once? I've lost 4 family members over the past 6 months, all from different causes, at least a month apart. Whew. And of varying closeness. I feel like right as I've started processing one, I've been hit by the next and I regress. Wow, that's a lot, Amanda. I wouldn't say you're regressing. I would say you're navigating some very intense and complex grief. I think other people here might want to speak to that.
Yeah, I can speak to that personally, in that I lost both of my parents in a 4-month time period, as well as a lot of deaths stacked on top of deaths. And it's a lot, and I would encourage you to be with it, even though it's hard and uncomfortable, talking about it, writing about it, allowing yourself to cry or not cry. There's no right way to grieve. We offer grief support services. If you want to talk to one of us, we have a 15-minute consult that's free. We have appointments you can book. We also have our Facebook group, again, where it is a safe place to express these kinds of things. We are very careful with who we let into the group, and we monitor it closely. But I think all of us would encourage you to stick with the emotions and share them as you can and as they come, either with trusted loved ones or journaling, or even just out loud to the people you've lost. That's, for me, something that's been a very powerful tool for healing, is to talk to my loved ones.
And also, and touched on it a little bit, but just being gentle with yourself, not setting expectations with yourself, not getting disappointed at things you don't get done, or the ways you respond, or or anything like that. This is a little bit strange, but I keep a picture of myself as a baby on my desk because whenever I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm doing a bad job or whatever, I just look at the picture of myself as a baby and I'm like, I wouldn't want that baby to feel these things or have these expectations of her. And so I don't know, maybe take that idea, put yourself as a baby on a desk, or yeah, just reserve some kindness for yourself and patience.
Yeah,
Some
you're
of the
gonna have,
tools that,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you're gonna have a lot of emotions that are gonna be moving through you as you go through this, and the challenge is gonna be to let them do what they need to do. And if you can sort of like step back and allow yourself to observe them, you're not gonna be able to do that all the time, but that's another way to sort of handle it, just sort of, allow it to come. And if you can step back and say, this is what I'm experiencing as part of this right now, because and shame's going to come up, fear, anger, all sorts of challenging stuff, and that is common. And it's just how you respond to it, and how you're able to be with it, and just sort of accept that you are going to be with these things as you process and integrate the grief. So that's my 2 cents.
I wanted to share that for me, a couple of resources that feel really important and are very accessible to everyone. One is to immerse myself in life, to be outside in nature, or to go to a botanical garden, or to visit a waterfall, or something that just feels so alive and active. There's something that is an unspeakable medicine to me from those experiences. And the other one is to notice how the grief is manifesting itself in my body, and learning how to metabolize that so that it isn't causing other physical problems for me. So if my nerves are jangled, or my stomach is tight, or some other sort of physical symptom of that kind of grief, what I do is something to metabolize it. And it might just mean shaking head to toe, just for as long as I feel like I need to expend energy and just let it flow out. It might mean going for a little bit of a peppy walk. It might mean dancing hard to a song for 5 minutes. Anything that is going to help my body work with that energy instead of it just running wild inside of my physical self. I see some things in the chat. Has anybody been tracking that can? And you're right, Anna, it is a lot. And especially with COVID, it is a particularly awful time to be dealing with death and loss in an era where you may not even be able to see somebody because of COVID limitations. It is a really difficult time for people. It is complex grief.
And Amanda, I want to thank you for sharing in the chat your journey and what you've been experiencing. And I love that you've said you've been embracing the crying, the chocolate, and spending time with your plants. Because it's really beautiful to see something like this. And it's something that we often have to remind people of, that when you're grieving, it is not only okay, but excuse me, essential to let in some joy wherever you can find it, be it a piece of chocolate melting in your mouth and that just scrumptious feeling, or spending time with your plants, your hands in the dirt and their new growth. Those are precious moments, and it's really important to remind yourselves that it is okay to let in the light, and necessary, even when you are feeling crushed by your grief. So I want to commend you, Amanda, and thank you for sharing that.
I also want to acknowledge Amanda's final post there about how complicated it is when people have different kinds of grief. Although you're all experiencing the same loss of people, your relationships to them were different. Your levels of connection and loss and experience of loss will be different. And that can be a really complicated time too, because those are the people that you should be able to process it with, the people who knew them the most, and when you find that you can't, or that you don't, your griefs aren't meeting in such a way that you can share that, you might have to go outside of that family unit to do your processing for a bit, until it gets to a place where it feels like you can, or maybe it won't. Depends on your family dynamics, I guess.
And also, I wanted to just suggest walking. When you feel really overwhelmed and consumed by the grief, by the anxiety, by the complicatedness of it all, if you are able to take a walk even around the block, it can really change things. Just moving a little bit, it makes the grief move, it moves you. So I would encourage, when you're feeling that, just go outside, even if it's half a block, even if it's, you know, out the door to the gate and back inside. A tiny little walk can really move all kinds of things.
Any other stories or questions, insights? Well, great. Thank you, everybody, for attending on behalf of the Virtual Death Doula Network. We're so grateful that you came, and we will send you links and such in the mail, email. Anything else? Any other parting words, you three, the fabulous three?
Well, thank you. We really appreciate everybody showing up. Please feel free to share